Okay, this is Joseph Holbrook with you once again in our series on religion in Latin America. I've got my nice little FIU tie on with my superpowers, and so I'm ready to I have my bottle of water, so I'm ready to go. So today we're talking about chapter 3 from Justo Gonzalez's book Christianity in Latin America, and this is about the fifth lecture in a series on religion in Latin America. So I'm going to jump right in. We're going to look first at the institutional church. And this chapter covers how the institutional church planted its roots in the American soil, the Western Hemisphere, the creation of dioceses and archdioceses, the growth in number of secular clergy as opposed to regular clergy, regular being the mendicant orders and the Jesuits, secular being the clergy that was under the authority of bishops and the regular episcopal hierarchy. We'll also be talking about religious orders and how they interacted with the outside world. Finally, we'll be talking about the Patronato Real, which gave the Spanish king the right to appoint church officials, which made them actually into um, officials of the state, in effect, as opposed to officials of the church. Ecclesiastical structure. In 1511, you had the first two dioceses. Dioceses were created in Hispaniola and Puerto Rico. After that, in Cuba, which had authority over Florida and Louisiana. Then in New Spain, which is modern Mexico. 1530 in Mexico City, a special one just for the city. All of these were under the Archdiocese of Seville in Spain. In the 1530s, additional dioceses were created in Peru, Venezuela, Colombia, Nicaragua, Guatemala, and four additional ones in Mexico. Along with this, there were church councils that were regularly held in the Western Hemisphere in the Americas. The Mexican church called its first council in 1555, and they discussed how and when the priest should perform the sacraments, what the qualification was for various levels of vows. They elaborated a prohibition against indigenous priests, could not serve in the priesthood. They also discussed how the clergy should behave, the lifestyle they should pursue, how to make the sign of the cross, recite articles of faith, how to teach Christian doctrine to the Indians, etc., etc. And the Second Council affirmed the results of the Council of Trent. The Mexican church did not even have a copy of the Council of Trent's decrees, so they didn't really know what they were when they affirmed them. By the Third Mexican Council in 1585, reform was in the air. The Mexican Council tended to be fairly severe in its actions. The Vatican repeatedly had to tone them down and soften some of their harsh punishments. In Peru, they also had church councils. The Second Church Council of Lima was in 1567 and divided its work into two parts. They focused on the Spanish population and also the Indian population. The council approved the ordination of mestizos, but it was fiercely resisted. In the Third Council in 1582, it was presided over by the Archbishop Toribio Alfonso de Mogrovejo, who was a literal saint. He arrived in 1581. Primary focus for him was the difficulty of the Indians with Christian modes of living, Christian marriages, communion, confession, learning the catechism. These were all difficult for the Native Americans to understand. Toribio Alfonso traveled all over Peru at least 4 times in his rule there on foot. He learned many Indian languages. He was a very humble man and very committed to the care of the people under his leadership. One Indian tribal group had a custom of trial marriage. A young couple could live together and even have a child, but then decide that they were not a good match and separate and seek another mate with no shame and no repercussions for the child. The child was not considered illegitimate. Of course, this didn't jive with Judeo-Christian thinking or Catholic doctrine, and so they had to persuade this Indian tribe to change their social structure. Whoa. The patronazgo was a tool used by Philip II to secularize the church and remove the parochial duties from the regulars. If you remember last week, we talked about Charles V had allowed regulars or the members of mendicant orders to take roles and duties and responsibilities that normally would be assigned to seculars, that is, the parish priests who are under the authority of the bishops. The problem was that the seculars tended to be poorly educated and had the reputation of living less than stellar lives in terms of moral example. And so Philip II used something called the patronazgo to begin the process of secularizing the church and removing parochial duties from the regulars. Oh, let me back up. Requirements for ordination included education, a source of income, racial purity, and Jewish. In other words, you had to be white with no taint of Jewish or Moorish blood. The Jesuit Jose de Acosta was a theologian and naturalist. He participated in the Third Council of Lima. He learned a number of different indigenous languages. He developed a philosophy of evangelism and conversion. He also had a certain level of rigidity in his attitude towards the indigenous people that he passed on to following generations. In contrast to Las Casas, Acosta believed that the Andean people were too simple of mind, as reflected in the limited vocabulary of their languages, to understand complex Christian religious concepts. Regular orders, as we've discussed before, are the mendicant orders, such as Franciscan or Dominican, Augustinian. They tended to be composed of European-born members, highly educated missionaries who were sent over to assist with the Christianization of the Native Americans. As the regular orders grew, they became very financially powerful. Secular clergy were often Creoles. That is, people of European descent, but they were born in the colonies in the Americas. They were also called criollos in Spanish. There were two kinds of convents for the women, discalced and calced. Discalced meaning barefoot, were more strict and austere and tended to adhere more to vows of poverty, prayer, a certain disciplined lifestyle. The calced were much more lax in their lifestyle and their observance of vows. A large convent might have 200 or 300 nuns. A locutorio was the reception room where guests could visit with their female relatives. A calced convent was expensive, only for elite women. It also required limpieza de sangre, in other words, a certificate that said that you did not have Moorish or Islamic blood or Jewish blood. The regulars specialized. Certain missions became specialized in certain things, such as the Jesuits in Paraguay, where they oversaw at least 11 Guarani missions. 1611, San Ignacio was the first mission in Paraguay and had 6,000 Indian residents. If you watch the movie The Mission, San Ignacio appears in there as a more established and older mission. The female orders or nunneries were the bankers of the urban settings. The Franciscans in Guatemala, this is kind of chistoso. The Franciscans requested royal permission to found a convent in 1529. By 1578, they got tired of waiting. They had still not received a reply, so they went ahead and took the initiative and established one anyway. I guess that was before the internet. Things operated slower back then. It took 50 years to get an answer. Sor Juana de la Cruz is one of the heroes of Mexican history and feminist history in Latin America. She was a brilliant and but illegitimate daughter of a Spanish captain, very precocious. She was raised by her grandfather, who had a large library and was very liberal in his approach to her and allowed her to study in his library. She was a nun. She became a nun of the Black Veil in San Jeronimo Convent of Mexico City. She wrote an essay on women's right to an education, which provoked the ire of the archbishop, who became her enemy. But for many years, she was under the protection of the viceroy and his wife, which sheltered her from the archbishop. Finally, when the viceroy left and a new viceroy was appointed, she was forced by the archbishop to get rid of her library and her scientific instruments. She eventually died in taking care of people during a plague. There's a film, by the way, let me back it up here. There's a film here called Yo la peor de todos. It's on YouTube. I, the worst of them all. And there's English subtitles. It's a film about Sor Juana's life. Las Nazarenas was a group in Lima that were discalced. It was a discalced nuns in Lima, Peru. I think they still exist today. I was looking at some pictures of them on the internet. So being discalced, they worked hard. They took part in daily religious rituals. They lived a truly communal life with meals and domestic tasks shared in silence. They carefully adhered to their vows of poverty, seeking no comforts in life. They had far less contact with secular people than their sisters in the calced convents. They nevertheless provided a service for the community. They prayed. So prayer was the service for the community. Santa Clara was another convent in 1604 in Santiago, Chile. They were under the Franciscans, but they petitioned to be transferred to the rule of the bishop. I don't know what the Franciscans had done wrong, but apparently they weren't happy with the Franciscans. Again, they didn't have the internet. They waited for an answer for 13 years and finally took matters in their own hands. This gets a little bizarre, and I find it mildly humorous. So the Franciscans, in an attempt to stop them, attacked the nunnery, but 60 nuns escaped to the Augustinian nunnery. The convent was surrounded by soldiers, but was defended by the male relatives of the nuns. So finally, this whole petition turned into a violent encounter. Finally, their request was approved by the Pope in 1661. That's, for those of you that are mathematically challenged as I am, that's almost 50 years. Actually, almost 60 years. In Mexico City, the same order went in the reverse direction. In 1674, they appealed and went from the archbishop to the Franciscans. So one nun even stabbed a priest in the arm. This reminds me of the nun from the Netflix series The Last Kingdom, who became a warrior nun. Social control. Studies remind us that religious women, some nuns, some not, were central to the building of the America's Christian identity. The church was in control of education and marriage. Both were extremely important for social control. And obviously, women were very involved in both education and marriage. Maria de San Jose became an Augustinian nun, a mystic, and wrote a 2,000-page spiritual autobiography at the encouragement of her confessor. She wrote about an incident where she believed she encountered the devil in the guise of a naked mulatto, which led her to a night of intense prayer and anguish. She also engaged in her private life in typical tortured asceticism and self-torture. The author says that Spanish society seemed to have passed straight from the tortured asceticism of the medieval to the convolutions of the Baroque, without experiencing the humanizing influence of the Renaissance. The church also was involved in education, which gave it a primary role in social control. The first two universities in Spanish America were founded in Mexico City and San Marcos in Lima, Peru, which is still there today. We have at FIU we have some contact and interaction with San Marcos, and I have a friend who is a professor there. The schools both created and reinforced the prevailing social order in the colonies. These institutions helped preserve dominant power structures by limiting their numbers to elite white males. Castas and Indians were barred from receiving any education at all, including elementary education. Both the Dominicans and the Jesuits focused on higher education. An interesting note is that Brazil had no university, not until after the Napoleonic Wars. For education, Brazilians had to travel to Portugal. That was partly by design, I think, to keep Brazil more dependent on Portugal. Marriage was another institution for social control. Under the authority of the church, Tridentine rulings allowed for certain impediments to marriage, such as degrees of consanguinity. In other words, degrees of familial connection, like first cousins or brothers and sisters. It was up to the priest to determine if the bride was free to marry. The priest also inquired if the two parties were entering the union voluntarily. Sometimes the priest would intervene to prevent a marital rape or to protect a bride's right to refuse to marry. In the cases of spousal abuse, the priest occasionally intervened to protect the woman. Religion and society. There's several stories here from the book. One is about Rosa de Lima, who was born to a Puerto Rican father and a Creole mother in Peru. She was extremely beautiful, but practiced extreme forms of penance. She became the first American-born saint of the Roman Catholic Church. Ursula de Jesus was an Afro-Peruvian mystic born into slavery in 1604. She worked at menial tasks for, I think it was 41 years. She was a slave and a nun. Her freedom was finally purchased by a nun of the Black Veil in Santa Clara, but she chose to become a donada, a type of love slave. What I mean by that is someone who voluntarily continues to serve. She had a special sense of mission for praying for people in, I don't have it written down here, but not in hell, but in, it begins with a P, purgatory. And she tried to pray people out of purgatory. Martin de Porres was another saintly man who lived in Lima, Peru. 1579, he was born to a freed woman of color and a Spanish administrator. He became well known for his love of the poor, his humility, his gift of healing, and his love for animals. He experienced prejudice even within his own monastery from his own fellow brothers. He had a special gift as a healer. He scourged himself every evening while repeating the slurs that had been hurled at him on the street. Martin de Porres became the first black saint of the Roman Catholic Church. Pedro Claver, the slave to the slaves. Pedro Claver arrived in 1610 in Cartagena, Colombia, with the Jesuits with the mission of ministering to slaves. He developed a team of translators because, as you might know, the slaves that were arriving at Cartagena were from many different tribal groups, different nations. They spoke different languages. So over time, Claver developed a team of translators and helpers who assisted him in caring for the slaves. For 40 years, he and his team of translators met the arriving ships and cared for the slaves, washed them, brought healing to them, fed them, and baptized 300,000 slaves. During the last 4 years of his life, he was bedfast and was neglected by the person who the slave who was assigned to take care of him. The road less traveled. Marina de San Miguel faced the Mexican Inquisition 1598. We know this. How? Because we have the inquisitorial records. In fact, that's records from the Inquisition are a very valuable source of historical primary source documents for history. She ended up confessing to multiple sexual relations with both genders. This is a very modern woman at 1598. Not that I'm knocking that, but it's not what you would expect. She had multiple sexual relations with both genders. She was in an open relationship with Juan Nunez. They did not consider their sexual activities sinful because they had carried them out with pure minds. Marina was arrested but not told what the charges were against her. She was accused of the heresy of alumbradismo, which was a type of mysticism and something somewhat cultic. She was gagged and paraded naked in 1601, fined and given 100 lashes. Of course, there's no pictures of her from 1601, nor could I find an artist's rendering, so I used a picture of Cersei from Game of Thrones over there on the left when she did the Walk of Shame. Magic was prohibited by church edict. It came from the devil. It was believed by the church authorities to come from the devil and was against God's wishes. Inquisitors tended to treat cases of magic as rather minor infractions compared to heresy or other form infractions. Magic had a secure place in colonial society. The largest category of magic in the Indies was love magic. A close tie between religion and magic existed in the minds of the practitioners. Magic took religious symbols and turned them into instruments to reconstruct daily life. The indigenous communities also found ways of continuing their rituals and practices, which some might view as magical, and also to cover them up or hide them through a veneer of Roman Catholicism. These rituals alarmed priests who took action with extirpation of idolatry campaigns. In 1610, extirpation campaigns began in the Andes. Father Francisco de Alava was sent to jail for exploiting his Indian parishioners. Once again, remember the two faces of the church. So there's a priest who's exploiting his parishioners. The first wave of extirpation campaigns ended in 1621. Another hardline archbishop died mysteriously in 1627. I didn't have it written here, but Francisco de Avila was sent to jail for exploiting his parishioners, but he managed to manipulate his way out of jail and put himself at the head of the original first wave of extirpation campaigns in 1610. So he used that to get as a get out of jail free card. Another campaign was launched in 1649 by the new Archbishop of Lima, Peru, and campaigns of extirpation did not happen in New Mexico for some odd reason. New Spain being the name of modern-day Mexico at that time. It's not known quite why this happened in Peru, but not Mexico. The religious atmosphere was definitely different in the Viceroyalty of New Spain. In Mexico, the cult of the saints took root more deeply than in Peru. In 1593, local artisans in Mexico City crafted a figure of St. Francis riding an eagle perched on a cactus, which is a pure Aztec symbol. For some reason, Spanish officials in Mexico did not seem to be threatened by the interweaving of pre-Hispanic religious practices and Christianity. The book doesn't say this, but I would suggest that one reason might be the form of massive evangelization campaigns that the Franciscans undertook in Mexico, where they did very little teaching or training, and they basically overlooked a lot of syncretism in order to baptize as many people as possible. And there were Franciscans in Peru, but also the Jesuits arrived and Dominicans, and there were not the same massive campaigns of conversion. Crypto-Judaism. A crypto-Jew is a hidden Jew, or a hidden Jew. We've already talked about new conversos and new Christians who were Jews who converted to Catholicism under duress at the order of the Spanish monarchy around the time that Christopher Columbus arrived in the New World, and many of them became, especially after several generations, became sincere, devoted Catholic believers. But they were always suspected of being crypto-Jews. Crypto-Jews were different than the conversos or the new Christians, who were actually Catholic in most cases. The crypto-Jews were secretly practicing their Jewish tradition while trying to hide under a veneer of Catholicism. And the Inquisition was especially devoted to trying to root them out. The Inquisition of Lima, Peru, was hunting for crypto-Jews from the 16th century. From 1580 to 1640, there was no heir for the crown of Portugal, and so the crown of Portugal was inherited by the King of Spain. And so you had the empires of Spain and Portugal were united in one empire. That's for about 60 years. So during these 60 years, Portuguese could travel anywhere in the Spanish Empire just as if they were Spanish. And of course, many of the Jews that had been expelled from Spain in 1492 and in the years after that had fled to Portugal, which was relatively more tolerant, as well as Holland. And so these Portuguese that could travel anywhere in the Spanish Empire were often suspected of being crypto-Jews or conversos or new Christians, and in many cases they were Jewish. Many new Christians moved to the Spanish territories of the New World, thinking that they were safe now that Spain and Portugal's crowns were united. In 1639, Manuel Bautista Perez and 10 other alleged crypto-Jews were executed in Lima publicly. In 1630 to 1654, the Dutch controlled portions of the Brazilian Northeast, and they were horning in on the sugar industry of Pernambuco and Bahia. Holland had practiced under Dutch Calvinism. Holland had practiced a much more tolerant form of religious policy. In a climate of fear and superstition, Spanish officials suspected that traditional indigenous and African rites, such as the using of tobacco or drinking of cola, to be secret Jewish rituals. Obviously, that's not the case, and in many cases, these were African rituals. In 1649, 108 suspected Jews were penanced in Mexico. 13 of them were actually executed by fire. Some had already died while incarcerated, and their bodies were burned. So, in conclusion, Christianity in Latin America began a process of change that the church itself did not even realize at the time. The church was intent on creating Iberian institutions of society in the new colonies. These institutions, of course, were ecclesiastical structures with dioceses, archdiocese, religious houses, and cofradias. The European church tried to impose its world order, its worldview on the Americas, but the colonies were a totally different world. The realities of racial mixtures and geographic diversity led to very different results. An American church was being born with American saints and American sinners in abundance, both in and out of the institutional church. The shaping of the faith in the Americas. Thank you for your kind attention. Feel free to send me an email or a comment on YouTube if you have any questions. I'll be happy to attempt to answer them. Until next week.